Okay, I want to try something different today. I hope you'll be tolerant. I put it on the title. I hope people got it. I agreed earlier this week, I think probably Sunday or so, I agreed to give a daf yomi shir for a conference I was attending. And I got totally sucked into it. Even though daf yomi is as far normally from my mode of learning as you get. I tried daf yomi, I think, for the first time in 10th grade, where you get the sense of what kind of kid I was, because having done, I don't know, 17 Bala Gemara in my life, I was trying to write a book about how to learn Gemara. And my Rabbi said, you really should learn some Gemara before you write a book about it. So I wanted you to daf yomi. And I tried, and it was Shkalim, which is this Yerushalmi that made it into the Bavli and to finish off Moed. And a month later, I was 11 lines in. I didn't understand any of them or something like that. Attempts at daf yomi, even though I have a strong family connection in a sense that my grandfather was a student of Meir Shapiro who founded daf yomi. I also got to hear my father tell me again this week one of his favorite stories of a late YU Rosh Yeshiva who came over to him to complain to him that nobody learns anymore. They just, right? The proof of it was all the daf yomi shurim. So I have this ambivalence. But trying to prepare this year, I got into it really sort of a rabbit hole, trying to think of what it would be like to prepare, even without doing any complicated halachic material or Rishonim, just trying to figure out what it means to try and convey a Gemara in its own terms so that people actually understand it coming out of it. Is there a way to do it in which, for people with something other than total recall, get something out of it? And one of the things that was really very challenging to me was realizing how much I depended on visual techniques in both learning and teaching Gemara, and realizing, I don't know, because I write, but realizing that most people listen. I get to wander around my house, right, where my wife has daf yomi playing often, and so I understand that most people listen to daf yomi shurim. They don't actually have the Gemara in front of them. So it's a really interesting, challenging thing to think about for me, to try and figure out how can you teach Gemara orally without showing it to people, because I instinctively think about it visually. And then there's a separate issue, if people aren't pure intellectuals, what do they get out of Gemara being taught at such in that fashion? And another big pedagogic challenge for me is to figure out how can you teach a Gemara in such a way, at that level, in such a way that, as opposed to being an end, right? People say, "Aha! Now I know this, and I don't have to ask these questions anymore." That learning Gemara actually is a way to open questions as opposed to close them. So I thought, try tonight to see what it would be like to give a daf yomi shir. I do have a source sheet, which I'll share with you, but I'm going to work on the presumption that not everybody sees the source sheet, and that it's something I have to work on pedagogically to be able to convey complicated Gemara material without visual aids, and see if that's at all doable. I am interested in knowing whether this is something that there would be interest in the shul, maybe trying with an experiment on when we get to a shorter Masechta at the end of Moed, which we should be some point after the summer. We should be at the end of Moed. There should be short Masechta. I'm also interested just in all your feedback as to what you got out of it, what I did wrong, what I did right, whether you listened to daf yomi ordinarily or not. Okay, so the daf for today was Yoma, daf Yud Aleph and Aleph, but in order to understand it, you have to go back to the very beginning of the Masechta. I'm going to share my screen now, but again, I'm going to assume that not all of you are reading, and if you, I'm going to put the Makar in the chat also, just in case. So you're welcome to follow along, but I'm not going to assume that. Okay, so the opening Mishnah of Masechet Yoma says that 7 days before Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol was sequestered. I think that's the best word we have, from his house into a space called the Lishkat Parhedrin. Parhedrin, that's all we know about it. It's a space in the Beit HaMikdash, presumably a space with walls, where the Kohen Gadol stays for all 7 days. Okay, so we're on a tangent about that. We get to Daf Yud, where there's a Breita, it's a by Tanur Rabbanan, where the Breita states as a rule that all the chambers in the Beit HaMikdash, Kol Lishkot Sheb HaMikdash, didn't have mezuzah, with the exception of that one place, the Lishkat Parhedrin, which has a mezuzah because the Kohen Gadol lives there for a week. Right? Whether it has a mezuzah just that week or all the time is not our issue right now. But that's the claim that just it's only one mezuzah in the Beit Hamikdash, and that's on that office where the Kohen Gadol stays for that week. Right? It implies that mezuzot are limited to places of residence. Rabbi Yehuda says that can't be true because there were lots of other spaces in the Beit Hamikdash where people lived roughly the same way as the Kohen Gadol, with people who were guarding the house or things like that. And they didn't have mezuzah. So if they didn't have mezuzah, so obviously somebody just dwelling there is not enough. So Rabbi Yehuda, and that answers that question. If this office requires a mezuzah and all the others should also, we never get a good answer for the first position, but nonetheless we're left with that their position is that one office required a mezuzah deoraita and none of the others did. But Rabbi Yehuda says the only reason only that one required a mezuzah was because it was a derabanan, that the rabbis required you to put a mezuzah there. Okay, so what's the issue? So the Gemara raises the question after some back and forth among multiple opinions as to what the reason is. The Gemara ends up with this answer, that the dispute is, what about involuntary living? The Kohen Gadol doesn't want to be there necessarily, right? It's a function of his office. So he's not there voluntarily. So the Gemara's conclusion at this point is that the people who think that that office required a mezuzah d'oraisa think that even if you're forced to live somewhere, it's still your home, so it requires a mezuzah. And Rabbi Yehuda said, nope, it's not. So it doesn't require a mezuzah. But then Rabbi Yehuda comes up with this deeply ironic reason that it in fact has a mezuzah. What he says is, but if you don't put a mezuzah on the door, then people will realize that the Kohen Gadol is there involuntarily, and they're going to talk about him as if he's in prison. It's really bad for public morale for the Kohen, for people to talk about the Kohen Gadol being in prison. Right? That creates perhaps bad morale about the whole Klapper ritual the Kohen Gadol is doing for everybody. I think that's probably the best explanation, although Rosh Steinzil had a slightly different one. And so Rita says, so how do we prevent that? We prevent that by putting a mezuzah on the door. And everybody knows, yes, that you don't put a mezuzah on the door of a jail cell because people are there involuntarily. So that creates the impression that the Kohen Gadol is there voluntarily, even though he's not. So it's always fun when you have these ironic zerot that are intended to prevent people from thinking what really it seems is the truth. Okay, now that rule that that people shouldn't say Kohen Gadol chavush v'veita asurin, that the Kohen Gadol is in jail, then generates a second sugya, which is also a little bit has a little element of ironic comedy in it. So the Gemara then asks, okay, so we know the machloket, the rabbis hold that that office required d'oraisa, Rabbi Yehuda holds it required d'rabanan. Now we have another brayta, and the Gemara asks, which position held this brayta? The brayta says the following: all the gates, kol hasharim sheyusham, the gates in that section of the Beit Hamikdash, that's all that matters to us right now. Lo hayah lahem mezuzah, didn't have mezuzah, except for Sha'ar Nikanor. Why Sha'ar Nikanor? Shelifnim mimenu lishkat parhedrin. So not only on the wall, on the doorpost of the parhedrin office itself, but even on the gate that led to that section, there was a mezuzah. The Gemara says, who could this be? Who could have said this? It can't be let's say it's the rabbis, because it makes sense. If you require, the pasuk says al-mezuzot beitecha u'visharecha, so houses, and for now we'll translate that as gates that lead to houses, So if the space itself, the living space itself, requires a mezuzah, so the gate that leads to it requires a mezuzah. So the chachamim of the Tanakama of our Braita, who said that the parhedron requires a mezuzah, so it makes sense that the gate should also. Rabbi Yehuda said we only put a mezuzah on the door of the room itself, or the chamber itself, because as a drabanan, it's not like Gemara applies, says he gufa xeros. If the reason to put the mezuzah on the door of the parhedron is only as a rabbinic, should we impose another obligation on? And now we have to put a mezuzah on the outer gate because we have a mezuzah inside it. So this is a version of what I think we usually call the mixed dancing question. Many of you probably know that all over the internet there are charts that explaining how the rabbis can prohibit anything in the world because you can create a long enough chain of circumstances that eventually any action you engage in can lead to mixed dancing. So there has to be a limit to the number of steps removed you can have. That's what the Gemara calls a rule, that we are not gozer gzera l'gzera. We don't impose multiple layers of prohibition. So this is not prohibitions. It's an obligation. You have to put the mezuzah on it. It doesn't really have an infinite regress. There's only so many places you can put mezuzahs on the gate outside, the entrance to the Beit HaMikdash, eventually, right? There's places that actually do require mezuzahs. Nonetheless, the Gemara uses this as perhaps as a sort of play on words, because it's also rabbinic and says, how can we impose a decree upon a decree? And the answer, of course, is all every time the Gemara brings this up is kula chalak zeri. No, it's really just one decree, and it makes sense here for sure, because if there's no mezuzah on the gate, but there is a mezuzah on the door, everyone will figure out that the mezuzah on the door is only rabbinic, and therefore they'll realize that the Kohen Gadol was actually there involuntarily. So this is a really interesting thing in Gemara. Like, why does Gemara always ask this question? Should we make right? Can we really make Xera l'Xera? When the Gemara has to know, as everybody else who's ever learned these Gemaras knows, that there's an answer, which is it's all one Xera, and that if you study the history of it, it's pretty much clear that you always have the option of saying it's one Xera. Some Achronim say this very explicitly. So it's always a matter of rabbinic discretion to say that whether we treat this as one decree, or we treat this as, and therefore fine, or we treat this as multiple steps. And the answer is that it's telling you something about the nature of rabbinic law, that you have to be conscious that because you have the power to forbid everything, you have to set rules on your own, right, on the exercise of your own authority. And so you have to be honest and say at some point, right, I'm really exceeding the reasonable bounds of authority when I prohibit A because it might lead to B because it might lead to C. But it's only a mood, right? Because sometimes, right, because these divisions are artificial. I think that's a very important thing to understand about halacha generally, that restrictions on rabbinic authority are generally self-imposed, and right then, and so when people point out and say it's arbitrary, it's not arbitrary; it's self-imposed, and it's left kind of discretionary and arbitrary are not the same thing. And also trying to tell students that right, really one of the best ways to restrain power is to be aware of how much power there is, and not just in your hands, but everyone else's hands. And even if you think you would exercise it responsibly, other people wouldn't. So you have to create a mood where if it turns out that lots of people have this power, then you have to come to a social contract where none of you exercise it. So the realization that you could, in fact, forbid everything because it leads to mixed dancing means that everybody else could forbid things because it leads to mixed dancing also. And you end up forbidding a lot less, I think, because you realize that everything could be forbidden. Maybe I'm optimistic. That's my impression, that if you think that there's no risk that it'll spiral out of control, then you do whatever is necessary. But if you understand that there are risks that the power will be exercised in a fashion that metastasizes it, you're much more likely not to use it. I think. I hope we train people to think that way. Okay. End of discussion of that particular gate. But now that we've moved from, we started from inside the Beit HaMikdash and talking about whether that chamber is considered a residence. Then we moved on to the gate outside it. So now we're going to move on to discussions of other gates in terms of mezuzah, and then we'll move back to other kinds of spaces to see whether they're residences. So the Gemara quotes a Breita. Tana Rabbanan introduces a Breita that is not literarily linked to the Mishnah, or it's also not from a Midrash Halacha. It's not from a collection that was organized by it was organized as a commentary on Shas as opposed to as independent halachic statements, even though it does quote a pasuk. The pasuk it quotes is our famous pasuk of Saftam Amazot Beitecha Uvish Arecha. So Vish Arecha is in your gates, it's plural. So that teaches us that there's more than one kind of gate, and we treat this as a general rule, basically that the default is that it includes all kinds of gates. Right? Echad Shari Batim, gates of houses, gates of courtyards, gates of Medinot, and gates of Ayarot. So Medina now we use as a state. That's not what it meant in rabbinic Hebrew, but I don't know that I'm confident that I can tell you consistently what the difference between a Medina and Ir is. But two kinds of gates that are at the entrances to very large populated spaces, not private property. All those yesh ben chovat mitzvah makom. They all have an obligation. Not clear to me whether the makom means to God, or more likely that the place has an obligation to have a mezuzah place there. Because again, we quote the pasuk again of the Uchsaftam mezuzot beisecha uvisharecha. So now that taken as a given that all these kinds of gates require mezuzot, although we'll see that can become controversial a little bit later. So now Abaye says to Rasafar, hang on a sec. There's these gates in the town of Mechoza, which is a a popular rabbinic city where it's a majority of Jews, and there are these gates there. We'll find out more about these gates in a minute. My tamalo Abdullah Rabbanan mezuzah. So why isn't there a mezuzah in Mechoza? So he said to them, interestingly, those gates, that shar is not there as an entrance to some place, but it's really there is chizuk la'akra da'kuvehu Davide. It's really there. They're really just architectural supports for what's built above them. Now, kuve, it's not clear what is built above them. The Davidson translation says a fort with turrets. Okay, could be. It could be that it's really supposed to be kuche. Some manuscripts have that, which might refer to graveyards. It could be it's referring to something like the shops above the cardo, right? But for our purposes, probably something like guardhouse makes sense, and maybe it has turrets, maybe it doesn't. But the point here is that you only require mezuzah when the gates are there actually as an entranceway, and not when they just happen when you're just building something as support for what happens above it. So long as the key space, right? If they're not an entrance, that means that really the key space is above them and not through the entrance. But it seems that you can still get into those places through that gate, even though they're fundamentally an architectural feature. So Rav Safra says to Rabbi says back to Rav Safra, but there is a person at least living in this space built above the gate. He says the prison warden lives there, which is why you get the idea that it must be some kind of guardhouse, because if the prison warden lives there, probably the prisoners are in that space also. So we ask, why don't you require mezuzah for the prisoners? So we already learned that you don't require mezuzahs for people who are there involuntarily. Right, and he says, he'll tell me, but it's fundamentally not for that. It just has this one little chamber in there for the prison warden. So maybe we still don't view it overall as a residence. So there's a rule about a Beit Knesset, right? A public, call it a shul or call it a public meeting hall, which Yeshbo based Dira l'Chazan Knesset, which includes a space for the Chazan. Then wasn't the cantor, but for whatever functionary was lived there to take care of the shul. So chayevet b'mezuzah. So as long as there's one person who lives there, then the gate at the entrance requires a mezuzah. We learned that about the Beit Hamikdash, it seemed, right, because of the one chamber to Kohen Gadol. So now we should learn it about the kuvi in Mechoza, because it has an apartment for the prison warden, and we learned it about shuls that have an apartment for the Chazan Knesset, or we say now, perhaps we'll see for the house which has the mikveh, there's an apartment for the mikveh attendant above it, or I guess I say it's Chaim, right, which has adjoining apartments, all those sorts of issues. So therefore, we're back to our question, which is, why don't we have a mezuzah on the gates of Mechoza? To which Rabbi gives a fascinating answer. Rabbi says, no, really, the gates of Mechoza should have had mezuzah on them, but we didn't put them on them because it's dangerous. Right? And this, he seems to be saying this not specifically for Mechoza, maybe. That's the implication of the following sugya. But rather in general, even though in a majority Jewish city, the city gates should have a mezuzah, but it's dangerous because Rashi says people will think that the Jews are putting amulets on the doorway, and therefore they're engaging in witchcraft. Right? So you know that if you're out doing Erev repair, that sometimes you have to explain to people why you are doing these things, and that can raise really interesting conversations. So people think about, why are you building an imaginary wall around our city? Sometimes it gets confusing. I think the headline in Palo Alto is the one I love quoting: Jews buy city, build wall. So you can understand, right? Baruch Hashem, we live in a place where we can do all sorts of things, and it's not, we don't see it as a danger for Jews to be engaged in, not only have public religious symbols and to be engaged in working with those public religious symbols, but Abai seems to think that it was dangerous in Mechoza, and the Gemara seems to think that maybe this is generalizable to other kinds of cities. Okay, so how do we know this? So the Gemara quotes the Breita, but it's not going to be clear whether the proof here is from the beginning of the Breita or the end. So here's the Breita. Mezuzah yachid nivdeket pamayim b'shavua. So a mezuzah on a private space should be checked twice a shavua, which means twice every 7 years. That you all know for your own mezuzot.
V'shel Rabim, but a mezuzah belonging to the public, Pamayim Bayovel, it only gets checked twice every 50 years. So you might think that's also because it's too dangerous to check it more often, but then you probably shouldn't check it at all. That's right. But Rashi gives a very interesting explanation. Rashi says, Kol davar shu shel rabim, everything which is a matter of public work, ein la triach alav harbe, you shouldn't impose a severe workload on communal needs. Shim titrach, because if you make it too much of a burden, everybody tries to walk away and claim it's somebody else's responsibility. But the implication is that as long as if it's just checking it, doing it once in a while, then everybody runs to do it because there's a certain prestige or satisfaction in engaging in public work. So it's a very interesting psychological theory Rashi has that you should try and divide up public burdens, but you shouldn't try and not impose them at all because perhaps people don't get anything out of them. But you should try not to make them too heavy because there's a tipping point where people stop saying, oh, great, I get to do this, and start saying instead, why doesn't that person do it instead of me? Either way, it should point out Rashi doesn't seem to think it's a high communal priority because if it were, you could just pay somebody to do it, and then this issue wouldn't come along at all. But these are the kind of things that either Rashi thinks that in principle it's better to have volunteers do them, or Rashi thinks that if you professionalize everything, then the community breaks down. I think it makes sense in Rashi's world to say, you know what, you want to create, and this is an ongoing sociology, you want to create enough demands on the community, enough ways in which people can contribute that everybody can feel that they're contributing, and that makes them feel more a member of the community, more invested in the community because they're doing things for it. We don't want to make it too much to the point where people start wondering whether the burden is being divided unfairly, and they start looking for other people to take their turn. I think that probably still stands. Okay, so that's probably irrelevant to the question of the gates of Mechoza. Now we get to the part that is relevant. The Rabbi Yehuda has a story which, in this explanation, is tangential. There's a story about an artavin. Nothing about that I know of what an artavin is, although I imagine that Latin people have done something with it. All we know about him is whatever an artavin was, apparently part of it was checking mezuzos, checking public mezuzos. And he was found by some kind of Roman official. The terms for Roman officials, at least by the time they make it to the Vilna Shas, are often not reliable. So some kind of Roman official, they're not telling him zuz, and you find him 1,000 zuz for checking the mezuzos at Tzipori, presumably because he thought he was violating a prohibition against public witchcraft. So okay, sakana becomes sakana for money as opposed to sakana to your body, or maybe we think that you have to give him 1,000 zuz because otherwise he was going to threaten him physically. Maybe the risk is, for those of you who a dated joke, right, that the risk is that they'll think that you use improper Latin grammar. Okay, okay, so now the Gemara says, hang on a sec, how could that story be true? The Amar Rabbi Lazar, Shluchei Mitzvah in Nizokin. Rabbi Lazar said that people, so Shluchei Mitzvah literally we use as agents of mitzvah, but generally understood, right? Generally, we don't impose the agency in the sense of being someone else's agent as critical. It's somebody who is not necessarily engaged directly in the mitzvah, but someone who is in the process of leading to a mitzvah. And Rabbi Lazar said that you don't get injured, you don't get damaged in that process. So how could this Kazdor find somebody 1,000 zuz for being engaged in a mitzvah of mezuzah checking? So we might answer that mezuzah checking per se is not really a mitzvah. The mitzvah is already done. You're just making sure that it's been done. But this is an important Gemara in a lot of ways. Probably many of you know the story of Elisha ben Avuya becoming a heretic, is because there are all these mitzvot that the Torah specifically says about long life, and he sees the kid at his father's command climbing the tree to be Mishalech et Takan, so this kibbut aim and the Shiloh Kain, and yet he falls to his death, and so Elisha ben Avuya becomes a heretic. There too, the question is, but isn't it, forget all the promises in the Torah, what about Rabbi Lazar? Shluchei Mitzvah. So this is might be one of the key ways to distinguish non-Orthodoxy and Haredi Jews in some ways is how likely you are to take this as a statement of fact that should actually yield policy. So the Gemara says the answer here as to how it was is where the damage is fixed really often it says the manuscripts here also have shchiach, where it's probable, right? Meaning that you can't take risks on the basis of this statement of Rabbi Elazar. Okay, but you can't take risks even without this statement of Rabbi Elazar. So it's like, what does Rabbi Elazar's statement? What does Rabbi Elazar's statement really change if you can't take risks based on it? So I think that in modern Orthodox we have a strong tendency to really, really minimize the effect of this. So mostly what we say is less that it will protect you than that we have perhaps a slightly higher threshold of risk when the purpose is valuable. Whereas you can find, I think, in more Haredi communities, like I think one of my nephews wrote a long disquisition about this. Really what counts as shchiach hazeka as opposed to what counts as not shchiach hazeka. So normally we have shomer b'seim Hashem, which is our threshold for what kind of risks you can take. But when it comes to a mitzvah, the threshold is raised slightly higher, but not so high as b'kfi hazeka. Okay, right? That might also be right. Certainly, it's a reasonable way of reading the text. But it's a whole interesting question about the extent to which we see, right? We're governed by the answer to Rishon Avluya that you can't rely on anything religious directly impacting this world, and to what extent you think otherwise. The Gemara is a really good proof that you can't rely on it, because when God commands Shmuel to go anoint Shaul, even before anoint David, even while Shaul is still alive and anointed as monarch, so Shmuel says to him, how could I possibly go anoint David? Shaul will hear and kill me. So God says to him, take an animal with you and pretend, right, that you're there just to sacrifice it. So if you're carrying out God's command directly, right, so that certainly is a mitzvah. We could try and do lumdus and say, no, it's a horas shah. But it sounds like, that the logic of Rabbi Elazar is obviously that you're trying to fulfill God's will and not a specific din in carrying out halacha. And God tells, when Shmuel says, but it's dangerous, God doesn't tell Shmuel, but the Gemara says, look, and he says, okay, take precautions. But that tells you that you shouldn't, right, that in cases where you can reasonably expect that something bad will happen, even if you're doing a mitzvah, you should, right, you have to take precautions. Okay. So that's why in the end, the gates of Mechoza, or that particular area, the gate of Mechoza didn't have mezuzah, was because at least in Mechoza, it was dangerous to put a mezuzah on public space. Okay, that finishes our discussion of the gates, and now we move on to houses. So Rav Kahana taught before Rabbi Yehuda that a Beis HaTevin, right, a granary, and a Beis HaBakar, and a cattle, something rather like they will have a Refet HaBakar, right, a barn, the Beis HaEtzim, and a woodshed, a Beis HaSarot, the storehouses for various, Rashi says, wine, oil, or grains, where nobody lives. So they are right, they're exempt from mezuzah. So there are two questions, right? Implies that otherwise they would require mezuzah. So why do they require mezuzah? Is that really a bayit? Is a woodshed really a house? So the answer seems to be yes, because it's outbuildings are part of the residential complex. But these are different because nashim neototpen. So what does neototpen mean? So Rav Kahana commented on his own brayta. So what I meant by neotot there was rochatzot, right? It means they make use of it, they get hana from it. It means that this was taken as a private space to shower in, and that means that it's a place where people stand around unclothed. I don't think it's anything to do with women specifically. It has to do with the pragmatics that women were more likely to seek privacy, I guess, and therefore, places where people wander around without clothes are not places where it's appropriate to put a mezuzah. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda says, what sounds to me like what you're saying is, right, as we just said, Tama, the Rochot says, the reason they don't require mezuzahs is because the women are taking showers there, hastama, but ordinarily, chayavin, right? Ordinarily, all these outbuildings would require a mezuzah. The Hatanya, but we have a brayta which says, so we have to keep track, there are going to be at least 4 braytot in play at the end of this. So first there's the brayta Rav Kahana teaches, which we just learned, which says that they all, right, that they all do have mezuzah, except for the ones that women take showers in. And now we have a statement that just says that cattle, barns, refet, bakar, turab mezuzah. So it implies that outbuildings, we're assuming that there's no difference among the outbuildings right now. It doesn't matter whether it's a woodshed or a cattle barn, do require mezuzah. So Rabbi says your brayta must be wrong. So Rabbi says, you know what, you misunderstood. You said mipnei shanashim neotot ben. It's because the women get use out of them, and so therefore you constructed a use that you thought would prevent them from having a mezuzah. But I think the correct meaning of neotot is what do they use it for? Mitkashtot. They adorn themselves. Rashi says that it means that they perfume themselves. I guess you need a space where the aroma doesn't carry, but you don't need that much light. Maybe that's where Rashi thinks that that outbuildings are a good place to put on perfume. And therefore he says, really what it said was, right, he didn't say because the women do it. Really what it said was, V'achikatane, af al pi, right, that all these outbuildings don't require mezuzah, no matter what, even if women use them for some purposes, they're still outbuildings and they're not actually part of your home. So as a basic machloket between Rav Kahana and Rav Yehuda, Rav Kahana thinks that all these outbuildings require mezuzah except if they're used for purposes that prevent the mezuzah, and Rav Yehuda thinks that none of them require a mezuzah whatsoever. And they argue about the meaning of the first price quoted, but there is one brayta left which says clearly there's no way to avoid it that outbuildings don't require mezuzah no matter what. Okay. So now Rav Kahana turns to Rabbi Yehuda and says, hang on a sec. You quoted a brayta to me which said that these outbuildings, especially cattle barns, don't require mezuzah. Right? Is that really true? Do you really mean that outbuildings that women perfume themselves in, right, don't require mezuzah? I learned in a brayta, and here's the brayta. The brayta says a cattle barn refit bakar p'turam in mezuzah is really exempt from mezuzah, but the ones in which women perfume themselves in chayev mezuzah are required in mezuzah. So you're wrong, right? We have a brayta that says explicitly that at least in the case where they do use it, but I think that they all require mezuzah. You think they never require mezuzah, and you had one brayta supporting you, but I have a brayta supporting me at least halfway. That says if women use them, they do require mezuzah. So, elamait lachonemar. So, what are you going to have to say? You're going to have to say that the case of barns which women do use is a tanai. The kashtot tanai. That's a machlokas tanaim. So once you already have to admit that the bright that you taught is not a collective position. It supports the first price that you quoted to attack me, but it doesn't agree with the bright that I just quoted to attack you. So once we admit that there's a Tannaitic dispute about this, so you know what? I'm going to claim. So so you claim there's a dispute about the case where the women adorn themselves. I'm going to tell you that it's always a dispute. So you'll tell me how do you know, right? How do you know that there's a dispute? Maybe the most extreme position is that if women use them for it, they require mezuzot. The answer is, well, I have a right to myself. The right learns from beitecha. So what does beitecha mean? So it means beitecha miyuchad lach. It has to be a house that is set aside for you, for human beings, excluding all the cases we have, right? A granary and cattle thing, and a beit ha'etzim and a woodshed and a storehouse. All those are exempt from mezuzah. But Raisa says the yesh nechayvin. But some people say they are obligated, so I'm home free. It turns out that there's a Tannaitic dispute, even in the case where just regular outbuildings which have no human use at all. And you interpreted the bright to support your position. I interpret the bright to support my position. It doesn't really make much difference because both positions exist. And his bright continues, Be'emet Amru, really they said, Beit HaKisei, which is a toilet, to Beit HaBursiki and a tannery, to Beit HaMerchatz, or a public bath, to Beit HaTvila, and a mikveh house without an attached apartment. And not really our mikveh houses, probably because we're not talking about ones with waiting rooms and things like that, but a place where people are, where in every space people are wandering around unclothed. So that's right. That's really a requote of the original Breita that Rav Kahana cited. So the Gemara is going to say, you know what? It turns out the way we've worked it out that this last Breita it has to be interpreted. Everybody has to interpret it their own way, also, because one of them has to because we have to interpret it in such a way that there's a dispute about the cases. There's at least a dispute about all the cases you want. The way we have it right now is everybody agrees. There's no way around it. There's a dispute about the case where the outbuildings are really used, and pretty much it seems like there's a consensus that there's no dispute about a case in which they're used for things that would make them as inappropriate. What we haven't proven yet is that there's a dispute about the case in which there are no human beings going into them either for showers or for adornment. So it turns out that each of them is going to read a Breita their way. Rav Kahana Metaretz L'Tamei. So Rav Kahana is going to read the Breita saying that there is an argument about the ordinary case because he needs there to be a position that you're chayiv in mezuzah even if it's just an outbuilding. Rav Yehuda is going to explain that no, the argument in that case is only talking about where they adorn themselves. But everybody's going to agree that outbuildings ordinarily don't require mezuzah. Okay, so we're going to present each of them are going to reread the Breita their way, right? So Rav Kahana is going to read the Breita as saying your house, meaning excluding a granary and all those things, if they when they have no other use. And some people think that they're obligated even when they have no other use. And everyone's going to agree. Everyone's going to agree that if people are taking showers in it, you don't do it. The Gemara says, hang on a sec. But if to read it that way is that it's talking about showers, but there was a case actually which said explicitly merchatz. So why do you need two cases talking about showers? The answer, which is very reasonable, is if so, that's the same case as the merchatz. The Gemara says, no, you know what? It really makes sense. There's a difference between a public shower, merchatz rabim, and merchatz yachid, and a private shower, which is what we're talking about here, an outbuilding in someone's private house, where women go to take showers. Because I might have thought, merchatz rabim the nafish zuamei, there is much more in a public bathhouse aside from the unclothedness. Even if there's a space where there's a waiting room, but it has a miasma about it. But a private bathhouse, that people take showers in sometimes, but that doesn't have a constant miasma, which makes it an undignified space. And also, it's just the whole atmosphere is different. So I might think that was a mezuzah, so that's why the Breita has to teach us both cases. Fine. But now, right? So now the Gemara goes. So Rav Kahana's explanation is fine, right? That there's a dispute about the case. There's a dispute about the case where it's not used for anything, but everyone agrees that there's no mezuzah if the women take showers there, and presumably the same dispute applies as if women adorn themselves there. Rabbi Yehuda says that the case which they argue about is even the case where they adorn themselves, but everybody agrees that if the outbuildings are only used for their normal use, what we call stam, right, unqualified, that they don't require mezuzah, and therefore he reads the second half of it to say that even though, right, the way he read the original Breita, that even though women adorn themselves in it, they're exempt from mezuzah. So that's his presentation, in which he says he has no Breita which indicates in his reading, right, there's no Breita which says explicitly that in an ordinary case where just regular outbuildings require mezuzah, Rav Kahana reads two Breita as saying that. He reads the first Breita as saying that the only reason they don't require mezuzah is because women take showers in them, and the same as the second Breita. Rabbi Yehuda says, but that's not enough. So the Gemara says, yeah, that's not enough. But the truth is, there's another Breita which does prove that Rav Kahana is right, that there was a Tana who said that all outbuildings require mezuzah. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda, Sama Divrei Kol Patur. Is it really true that everybody agrees that that there's no chiyuv and mezuzah for outbuildings? We have a Breita. Okay, so the relevant part of the Breita is the first part. The Breita says, Bish Arecha, what does that mean? It doesn't matter whether it is Sharei Batim, right, gates for houses, or for courtyards, or Medinot Ayarot, we have that again, but here's the key thing if it was in, or if it's a refet, if it's a barn, Bilulina, or if it's a chicken coop, or Madbain, or granaries, right? All those things, right, or wine storehouses, or oil storehouses, all those are Chayav b'mezuzah. Okay, so this Breita, the Gemara says, even though Rav Kahana didn't quote it, we have a Breita, and so there's no way out of it. There's a Talmudic dispute about regular outbuildings. There's a Talmudic dispute about outbuildings that have occasional human use, but probably there's no dispute about about outbuildings that are used as showers. Or even then, you could read a text as a way to read a dispute even there. Having quoted this Breita, the Gemara then goes on to continue the rest of the Breita. The rest of the Breita is going to be saying things you might have thought were excluded from mezuzah, or things you might have thought were included in mezuzah, but we're going to exclude them. All right, so here's how we do it, right? So, Yachol Shani Marbeh, I might think you include even a Beit Shar, which is not which is a sort of an anteroom built outside the gate of a courtyard. So I might think that requires a mezuzah, or a chsadra, just some kind of porch or mirpeset that's clearer Right? There's a dispute whether it's a beit shar liach sadra or liach sadra is a separate space, or a mirpeset is kind of like we have those motels with multiple stories. All the entrances are outside, so there's a balcony which outside which leads to the entrances to the individual rooms. So if you have an archway, if you have a gate leading to that parapet that runs around, so that is not actually the entrance to the residences. It's just right. It's not treated as a public courtyard. That's just right. That's just an entrance to a neutral space. So I might thought that requires mezuzah. No, Talmud Lamar by it. That's right. That's not attached to the house. Just like the house has to be miyuchad ladira, it has to be a place where people actually reside. So these are not places where people are not considered to be living on that porch. It might very well depend on what the social use of that porch is, whether it's just a space you can walk to, or whether you put chairs out on it. Once you put chairs on it, so then it probably becomes miyuchad ladira, and that has implications for other purposes as well. I might think you should include toilets, beta kisei, beta bursiki, tanneries, right? All those cases we saw before, right? Shout bathhouses and mikvahs. Talmud bayit. So here it frames it as ma bayit asui lekavod, just like a house which is done for kavod. So what does it mean? A house is done for kavod. So you could say that it's a house that's built for dignified purposes, and somehow these are not. Obviously, a toilet is not a dignified purpose, but why isn't a tannery a dignified purpose? That's a little bit odd. I don't really understand what the Steinsaltz translation had, that they honor the person. I don't really understand it at all. But the best I can do is dignified use. If it's not intended for dignified use, then it doesn't require mezuzah. And then we go back to our original issue. I might have thought that all the rooms in the Beit HaMikdash required a mezuzah. Talmud Lomar bayit. So that we have the word house. The word house means ma bayit shuchol, just like an ordinary house is not sanctified. Afkol shuchol, right? So therefore, the only things that require mezuzah are things that are also unsanctified. Yasu elu shein kodesh, as opposed to the things on the temple which are sanctified. We'll see that that's a matter actually of dispute in some dispute in a moment. Okay, we finished our tangent now, quoting with a parent tangent, although we'll see that associatively, quoting the end of this brayta is what leads to the rest of the sugya. We go back to saying to Yufta that we originally interpreted Rabbi Yehuda as saying that there's no dispute about outbuildings in which aren't used for human purposes, and that was proved to be wrong. Okay. Now we're going to go. Yes. Now we're going to go back to a separate issue about gates requiring a mezuzah. So Rosh Bar Yehuda Tani Rosh Bar Yehuda Kamei Rava. So Rosh Bar Yehuda teaches in front of Rava there are 6 gates that are listed that are exempt from mezuzah, and he lists 7. Right, they're familiar ones. Right, there's the granary and the cattle barn and the woodshed and the storehouse, and he lists something new, which is Shar Hamadai, a gate built in the form of the Medians, however you pronounce it, Medeans. Which Rashi tells us helpfully, we'll see, which is right, that they built rounded gates as opposed to square gates. So they don't have the classic form of mezuzot where they have doorposts and a lintel. The shar sheina makura, or things which have no top at all. The shar sheina gavoa asara, or if the gate doesn't reach the height of 10 tvachim, right, the 30 or 40 inches to be a halachically significant doorway. So, but that's 7 cases. So Marley, so Rava says that was 7. You started with 6, and you said 7. So he says I started with 6 because I put the 7th one in, even though it's controversial. And Shar Hamadai Tanoihi, the Medain gate is a Tanaic dispute about whether it requires a mezuzah or not, because we have a brayta which says kippah. Right, a kippah can be translated as a dome, but it really just means a rounded arch, and we could discuss whether it'd be different if it was rounded or if it came to a point. Remeir mechayev mezuzah. Remeir requires a mezuzah. Bechachamim potrin. And then we get to the point which generates the next argument: is shavin shem yesh biragla asara shechayev b'mezuzah. So everybody agrees that if there's if the doors, if the arch is built on top of doorposts that are of already 10 tefachim high, so even though what's built on top of them is an arch, we imagine the arch. We don't really care that whether the lintel is straight. All we care about is that there's something which is on top of mezuzah A, and on top of mezuzah B, and is connected above the heights of each end. Okay. Now Rabbi says you should really qualify that. Really, he says everybody agrees that that if you have an archway that has no doorposts, at all. All right, it's just an arch from the beginning, so that doesn't count. And everybody agrees that if it never reaches the height of 10 tvachim, no matter how straight the doorposts, or even though the doorposts are at least 3 tvachim high, that doesn't count. What they argue about is is if the archway at its height, there's a space that gets you to 10 tvachim, and on each side there are doorposts at least 3 tvachim high, and those 3 tvachim high doorposts are at least 4 tvachim apart. So you have a 3 tefach high, like a 10 to 12 inch high normal doorway, right, where it has wide enough to be a doorway, and then you above that, right, you get to the right height of 10 tvachim, but it's no longer wide enough. But you have enough materials, right? So as opposed to the dome or the arch being built of materials that just surround the open space, actually what you have is, let's show it as a rectangle with the space of the archway empty in the middle. So you could just cut away material, and you would get a doorway of the proper size. So the mayor says that we cut away the doorway, right? As long as it gets 3 tefachim high enough, and if you cut away material, you would get a 10 tefach high by 4 tefach wide doorway. That counts as a door, and the Chachamim say no, it doesn't. So that's the case they argue. They argue about that intermediate case. It's very rare, I think, in the contemporary world that we have arches that are that low. But sometimes on ground floors, I guess, where there's really clever architecture. And it gets more complicated if it's much wider. But so I'm not doing psakim as at all. But you could treat it as if you can carve out an open space which is surrounded in some way, which is a 10 by 4, then you're probably okay. Any space which is less than that becomes too complicated. Okay, one more braita about houses and mezuzot. Right, we have a braita which says that a Beit HaKnesset and a Beit HaIsha, a house owned by a woman, or a Beit HaShutfin, or a house owned by partners, is chayevet b'mezuzah, is obligated mezuzah. So the Gemara says da, right? Pshita is always translated as da. So the Gemara writes, so here we're going to have two sugyot that have this form. We're going to put a braita. We're going to say that's too obvious to bother saying, and we're going to tell you what we might have thought, which turns out to be wrong. But then we'll find out the next sugya that not so wrong. So here we have braita which says that shuls are chayav mezuzah, as are houses owned by women and partners. Why would I have thought not? Because the pasuk says beitecha, and that is somehow understood to be masculine. Always an issue trying to figure out when Midrash Halacha treats the biblical Hebrew neuter as neuter and when it treats it as masculine. So I might think not a house belonging to her, it has to be owned by a man. Beitecha, I might think it has to be owned by someone singular, and below but to him, and not a house owned by plural people. Kamash Malan, we learn it out in the end, right? In the end, that's wrong. So I think Gemara says, why not? Right? Once you have a really cool pasuk teaching you not houses owned by women, not houses owned by partners, why not say it's true? So the Gemara says, the reason that is the Torah tells you the purpose of this is Leman is a purpose. Your buya beichem v'mevenechem, right? So it's for the sake of yours and your descendants' lives, right? The days of life being extended. So the Gemara says what? And women and partners don't require life. Hani bo chai, hani lo bo chai. That's absurd. Obviously, mezuzah applies equally to houses owned whether by men or by women or by individual men or by partners. But that doesn't really answer the question. We'll note for now. What about shuls? Shuls don't really have owners, so you can't make the argument what hanu bo chai v'hanu lo bo chai. So the shuls are left in abeyance right now. And so the Gemara's temporary answer is okay. If it doesn't exclude women, it doesn't exclude partnerships. What does it exclude? So I might have thought it excluded shuls, but that doesn't say that. The Gemara says Ela beitecha lamali kiderava dama rava, because Rava said something we have to figure out how serious. So we take this as midrash halacha. Derech biatcha. Beitecha is really a pun. You should read it as biatcha, right? The way in which you come in, and that's how we learn that right, since people start, most people, right, obviously, here we are being very, very. I'm sure that's the word for right hand is centric, right? Most people, when they start walking, they move the right foot first. Therefore, the mezuzah should be on the right side as you walk in. Okay, it's say the word beitecha to teach you derech be'atcha. Sounds more like an asmachta than a drasha, but what can we do? Right, we're really left with the case that it turns out that we have a reasonable basis for excluding shuls, and we haven't really understood why that is wrong. Okay, another brayta, which introduces another halacha and says the same three places: a shul, a beit hakneset, a beit hashutafin, and a house owned by partners, a beit haisha, and a house owned by women. Mitamin ben agayim. They can acquire tzarad habayit, assuming there is such a thing as tzarad habayit in practice, which we talked about a few weeks ago. The Gemara says again, pshita duh. Why would I have thought not? So the answer is we have a pasuk just like beitecha uva asher lo habayit. Right, by house nigayim, it says that the one to whom the house belongs comes. Okay, so I might have thought that meant lo v'lo la, right? It meant it belongs to him and not to her. Lo v'lo lahen, it belongs to him and not to them. So this is wrong. So the Gemara says the same thing. I might think, why isn't that right? So the Gemara says the base eretz achuzatchem. That they have another part. The pasuk before it said that negat tzaras applies to the house of the land of your homestead, which we assume means no matter who among you owns it. Okay, so then the Gemara says elo lo lamali. So why do we have the word lo? And the answer is here again we have something that doesn't seem quite halachic. It's telling you why do you get negei batim is mishim yachid beitolo. It's only people who are selfish about their house who keep it to themselves. Meaning she'nero tzela hashil kilav. He doesn't want to lend his utensils to his neighbor. Ve'omer she'ein lo, and he says I don't have any. And now the nega comes and you have to empty out your house. So Kodesh Baruch Hu mifar smo kishim mefanet beiso. So when the halacha forces him to empty his house because of the nega, so that's right. So God exposes him. So it's midah k'neged midah. It's poetic justice. Prat l'mashil kilav la'acherim. Right. So, but you wouldn't get negei batim if you lend your utensils to others. So does that mean halachically that the kohen, when somebody comes to me and says kenega nira l'debayit, that it looks like there's a nega, the kohen goes and asks all the neighbors, does this person lend their stuff to you or not? So again, hard to know how serious to take it halachically. And again, if we look at the sugya, we say, hang on a sec, you explain why I might have thought that the house of partners is excluded, and why the house owned by women is excluded, and we said that was wrong, but you didn't really come with a good reason as to what is excluded by the word lo, and there's a candidate in the Breita, which is Beit HaKnesset. So what do we think? Do shuls get negat tzarad or not? That leads us to we had one Breita which said it does, right? So Gemara says, right, so, but Gemara says, Beit HaKnesset b'im tamei b'negayim. So is it really true that a Beit HaKnesset does get negayim? But we have a Breita which says, Yachol, right, there's that word again. I might have thought that shuls and batei midrash get negat tzarad. Talmud lomer uvah shulo habayit. Mishum yuchad lo yasu elo shem yuchadin lo, right? So it turns out that that there is a good drasha to exclude shuls. So how good, right? So now we have dueling braitot. What should it be? How do we resolve this? How do we resolve these dueling braitot to shuls and batei midrash get negat tzarad or not? So the Gemara answers, lo kasher, no problem. One position is Remeir, and one position is Rabbanan. How do we know that they argue about this? Because we have a Breita which has the exact same dispute about mezuzot, which is presumably based on the issue of whether Beitecha ends up excluding shuls or not. Right? So we say Beit Knesset sheyesh bo Beit Dira lechazan Knesset chayav mezuzah. That we saw already, that if it has a dwelling place for the chazan, then everybody agrees it requires mezuzah. But if it's just a shul, Remeir mechayev the chachamim potrin. So just like Remeir says it's obligated mezuzah, he thinks it can get negei batim, and just as the chachamim say that it's not obligated in mezuzah, they would say you can't get negei batim. And then the Gemara says logically, of course, there are other ways we can resolve it. We can say that it's both the rabbis, but one of them is talking about a case where it has a house for the Chazan Knesset. That's presumably the Breita, which doesn't follow it up by saying, but if it has no dwelling place, and the other one, the one which has no such qualification, is talking about a case where there is a dwelling place, and that's why it's chayav. Or I could say they both, neither of them. This is a really interesting one. Neither of them have dwelling places in them, but it makes a difference whether. There's a difference between shuls in large cities and shuls in small cities. That's a really interesting claim. What does that mean? Why should that make a difference? So the answer Rashi says is that shuls in large cities do not have defined owners, because anybody, really, shuls in large cities belong to everybody, because everybody comes in and davens there. So they're treated as really undifferentiated property. And at least we learn from from Asher Lo Habayit and from Beitecha that there has to have some kind of defined ownership. But shuls in small towns, they belong. They're like partnership owned things. They belong to the people of the town who daven there, and therefore they are chayiv mezuzah, and they do get nigayim. So the last two answers of the Gemara makes it right. The first answer of the Gemara is it's machluket. The second answer of the Gemara is that it all depends on whether there's a house in it or not. If there's no house in it, everyone agrees that it doesn't. There's no residence. Everyone agrees there's no mezuzah. If there is, everyone agrees there is. And the last one is it really depends whether there's defined owners or not. It's really interesting to think about whether the Israel Sharon for these purposes is the big city shul that belongs to the world, or a small town shul that only belongs to the people of the city. Okay, then the Gemara says, hang on a second, is it really true that shuls in big cities cannot require negaim? But we have a brayta which says achuzatchem. It's the base areas of achuzatchem means that only property that can be defined as a homestead can acquire negaim. The any Yerushalayim mitamah benagim, but Yerushalayim doesn't become tamei negaim. The Rabbi Yehuda says, I didn't hear that about Yerushalayim. I heard it about the Makom HaMikdash. But the suggestion of Yehuda says, what I only heard about the Makom HaMikdash means that, right, so the rabbis thought Yerushalayim was exceptional. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, even Yerushalayim is not exceptional. It's only the Mikdash. But Rabbi Yehuda thinks that the other shuls in Yerushalayim can get Nigayim. And presumably the rabbis thought that the shuls in other cities could get Nigayim. So obviously we don't use the word Asher Lo Habayit to exclude shuls. So how could you claim that shuls are excluded according to some positions the way we answered it before? So the Gemara answers, really, Rabbi Yehuda really said not any shlamati Makom Mikdash bilvad. Really, Rabbi Yehuda says ani lo shlamati ela Makom Mikudash bilvad. What I said really was that that the only place which can't get negaim is the Beit HaMikdash. Now we've run full circle. The opening discussion on the daf, or as the introduction to the daf, was whether any place in the Beit HaMikdash required a mezuzah. The end discussion is whether any place is a statement that everybody agrees that you cannot get negaim in the Beit HaMikdash. And the Gemara says that the dispute about Yerushalayim generally is that the Tanna Kama held that Yerushalayim could be called Achuzah because it was divided between Yehuda and Binyamin, whereas Rabbi Yehuda held, Tanna Kama held that Yerushalayim can't be called Achuzah, so it can't get Negaim because it wasn't divided. Rabbi Yehuda held it was divided between among the tribes, so it could get Negaim. But the end of the line is that there's a version in which Rabbi Yehuda says that the Beit HaMikdash is the only place which can't get Negaim, which we pointed out last week can be ironic because there's a Midrash Agadah which treats all of Negei Batim as a metaphor for the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And the end of the Gemara says that every place other than that all shuls, all publicly sanctified spaces are exempt from Negei Batim. Okay, that is the end of the shir. I'm happy to take questions, or alternatively, I'm happy to take feedback, both about whether you enjoyed the shir and whether you think there would be any market at all if we tried to run it as an experiment sometime perhaps in the fall or the summer, to do it for one Masechta and see if there's a market for something like this in the community.
Rabbi Klapper.
Yes, Sam.
I enjoyed this year. I had one question at the end, though. I mean, probably because I didn't understand it, but I think last time you said that there were 3 things that were never going to happen, even though we learned it in the Torah. And the last one was about getting Negaim on a house.
Right.
So why did they even bother asking a question about getting it on a Beit Knesset?
Yeah. So, but even that position, right, says Drosh v'Kabel Schar, right? It's not intended to shut it off, right? It's intent, right? I talked about this a little bit last week, right? Should it be any different? That it can't be that you don't learn it, because that's exactly what they say, Drosh v'Kabel Schar. you might think that the way we should learn it is entirely homiletically and not halachically, right? So that was what really interested me. I wrote about this last week. We didn't talk about it anywhere near as much in the shir, right? Right? Is what is the status of halachic discussions of imaginary halachot?
Okay.
Right. So I think I called it. I think the clever thing I tried to do with the title was I said, Herzl famously said, "Im tirtzu enzu agadah," right, which translated, if you will, it is no dream. Probably didn't say it in Hebrew, but that's how it got translated. Right. The yeshivish joke was always about, it doesn't mean you can say im tirtzu enzu halacha, right? Right. Halacha exists regardless. Right. Willing it doesn't make it halacha. My point was, okay, it's not a im tirtzu enzu agadah. So when you have a legal discussion of things that halachas that are purely hypothetical, so what are they? Are they halacha? They're not agada, right? They're not agada because they're not, they don't meet the genre. But are they halacha? That's a really great question. The Rav said, and hopefully I'll finally finish my article on that in the next few days. The Rav said that really, learning halacha is always that way. It does, right, for the ish halacha, right? That wasn't the Rav himself, but his description of the ish halacha, that type, was, he said that you should learn halacha the way you learn pure math. The halachic discussion is valuable in and of itself. You build this intellectual universe. And then when you finished it, like, his model was non-Euclidean geometry. When you finish building your coherent system, then you bring it to the world. And if it turns out that there's something like it in the world, cool. And if there isn't anything in the world, so put it. I built this beautiful thing.
Right.
Right. So that was the Rav's argument, but it's not, I think, the most intuitive way of thinking about Talmud Torah. But the Rav builds a universe. Right? The Rav says, like, for the Isha Halacha, right? I think for that type, that Gemara which says that that it never happened and never will happen, but you're supposed to be Drosh v'Kabel Schar, he assumes that means you're supposed to learn the halachot, just as if they were practical, and you get reward for that. It doesn't matter. So I think that's it's a really interesting self-examination about for what one's sensibility is, whether that's obvious to you. Of course, learning the halachos matter. Understanding Dvar Hashem in conceptual terms is powerful Talmud Torah, regardless of whether or not it's going to happen, or whether you think, what? Obviously, this is about law. And if it's not, and if you're not going to implement it, then what sense does that make? That's like probably a good way of dividing the world, as a brisker, right? Briskers divide the world into two types: briskers and non-briskers. So this is a good way of finding out which one you are.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? All right. Thank you for listening. I apologize. It wasn't exactly what has normally been. We'll go back to our regular scheduled Parsha Shir next week, God willing. Yeah. Marty, yes?
No, I was going to say, I think there'd be a small market. I think there are some people who would, but I don't gravitate to daf yomi, right? And I think, so I've often thought similarly, for a small masechet, but even that's still a month of commitment, right, to doing this. And for me, it's more, it's a fog of ideas. It's hard enough for me to do daf shavua, more or less. So anyway, that's just my take. Yeah, I wouldn't want to. And I can't, necessarily project my, that on others. But
okay,
that's my take on it.
Yeah, for me also, right? But I feel like I should know stuff, but I can't actually do daf yomi for myself. But it turns out that preparing it, maybe I could do, because it took me probably preparing this year. Probably at this point, I'm already like 12 to 15 hours in.
Right. So that's so you're learning it, as you would any other daf. I imagine it would be a challenge to do that every day.
Well, I don't know. It's an interesting challenge for me. It's a really interesting challenge for me, and then to see if I can digest it. That's part of your testing. Right. Can I digest it in a way which is still useful and entertaining, and maybe not. Right. Maybe not. This was better the first time I tried it.
Right. And people who've some people who do daf yomi regularly, and I've been doing it for more than one cycle. They say, okay, when they see it the second time around,
they recognize it,
and then by the third time around, they maybe they're picking it up. But they say it in a positive way, and I guess like anything else, you do get a breadth of coverage. Question, for me, my retention is virtually zero. So, I'm not sure what I would get at. I mean,
that makes sense. If you came out of this feeling your retention is going to be zero, then it's not the right thing.
Well, it depends. I mean, so I think part of the notion of daf yomi is just the activity itself, right?
I trust you to learn. Learn stuff you'll retain. That's my take.
Well, okay. All right. So,
all right.
Shabbos,
good.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Vivek. All right. Shkoyach, everybody. Have a great Shabbos, and God willing, we'll see you with regular partnership here next week.